So let's talk a little bit more about the evolutionary argument against naturalism. We actually had a discussion on this, and if you're watching, you can go back through the videos and you can check it out. We had a little bit of a discussion between Tyler and Stephen Law on this argument. And so, but let's go into it a little bit here. So just sort of lay it out, how the basic structure of it goes, how some typical responses, and then some objections and all that.
So the sort of classic Plantingian evolutionary argument against naturalism goes something like this. On naturalism, the sort of best game in town to make sense of the world is neo-Darwinian evolution. And it's typically seen that neo-Darwinian evolution might have tension with, say, theistic or Judeo-Christian belief. And Plantinga actually argues that that's actually not the case. That's not the case. In fact, if anything, there's tension with naturalism and neo-Darwinian evolution. And so he argues that upon reflection of both of these tenets, the naturalists should have a defeater for trusting that their cognitive faculties are reliable. And that's because their cognitive faculties are aimed toward just producing beliefs that enable survival and reproduction. Patricia Churchland calls it the 4 Fs: fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing. Slight joke in there if one's paying attention. So the idea is that if my faculties, say, aren't aimed directly at producing true beliefs, but rather beliefs that enable me to meet the sort of Darwinian requirement of survival and reproduction, then why should I trust my faculties that have come about through via random genetic mutation? And if I have a defeater for trusting that my cognitive faculties are reliable, I also have a defeater for trusting the beliefs they produce, which includes the belief in naturalism. So naturalism becomes sort of self-defeating in that sense. One of the, I'd probably say the sort of the mainstream response is to say something like this. If there's a glass of water in front of you, and you're thirsty, and the only way to survive is going to be to produce belief that there's a glass of water in front of you, then it seems likely that actually evolution would sort of indirectly, if you'd say, have our faculties aimed at producing true beliefs, because beliefs that enable survival are likely going to be true. And so this is sort of the mainstream response, we'll call it that. And so Plantinga has his own sort of response. Plantinga thinks, for example, if you're seeing a tiger in the forest, and the idea is the tiger's going to eat you, so you better get out of the way. Plantinga thinks that as long as the subject perceives one false thing about the tiger, say that the tiger's a witch, all right, so it has a property of being a witch, and someone forms the belief that there's a witch, right there, or the witch is gonna come and kill me. That's actually a false belief, right? That's not a witch.
But it seems sort of sufficient to produce the kind
of
behavior.
That's right. Sufficient to produce the behavior to get my body parts in the right place at the right time. And so I believe it's Fodder who argues that, well, you still have other beliefs, though, that are true, namely that there's something fierce, or that there's something dangerous, or that you better get out of the way or else. And then Plantinga's response to that is, why couldn't we be evolved in such a way as to not sort of believe those beliefs which are entailed by our belief? So very few epistemologists, actually, I can't name one that come to mind, thinks that just because we believe P and P entails Q, that we necessarily believe Q. And so why can't we evolve in such a way as to not really reflect all the time, or at least in this sense, on the consequences of our beliefs? And we just have the simple belief that there's a witch coming to eat me. And so if that's the case, then it should be a false belief that's sufficient to get my body parts in the right place at the right time. Now this sort of response hasn't satisfied its skeptics, right? The argument skeptics. I do find a sort of a more compelling version of this argument. This is the version that I used in the dialogue that you hosted. And it's formulated by Tom Criss. By no means am I taking credit for it. Tom Criss, philosopher out of Biola, has a forthcoming paper in the Blackwell Companion to Naturalism. And he argues that instead of focusing sort of on all beliefs, let's focus on beliefs that are arrived by way of abductive reasoning and, for instance, the best explanation. And he thinks that, rightly so, that abductive reasoning requires imagination. So the example he gives is, so you wake up in the morning, early in the morning, and you see that there is a bowl of empty cereal, right? Or a bowl that was used for eating cereal on the table. You only need a couple of ideas to sort of have a good explanation for what's going on, right? I mean, you don't have to, your imagination doesn't have to be stretched too far in order to conclude that probably your kids woke up slightly earlier than you and ate it. I mean, the other options would be something like a robber broke in and decided to eat some cereal and then just jet off, or maybe your parents came in, somehow unlocked the door and came to visit you, ate some cereal, and then decided to leave again. Other than that, I mean, there's only so many explanations, right?
But so the basic idea seems to be that you have to use some sort of imagination
to
be able to think of some possible explanation.
That's right.
As to why it happened.
So then he argues much more imagination, though, is going to be needed when we start talking about if string theory is true.
Okay.
Or is presentism true, or some sort of eternalism true? These sort of high-level scientific or metaphysical beliefs that we have or debate about. These sorts of things, our imagination is going to have to be much more robust and reliable and so forth than in the previous case mentioned. And so it's on reflection that why would naturalism, I mean, maybe you think it's plausible that naturalism would give us sufficient imagination to know that there's like an intruder in the house, or not. But why think that naturalism would, on naturalism, that we would have this sort of more robust imagination and reliable abductive ability? And there really is no reason. I think we should be the probability is inscrutable. We should remain agnostic, sort of off it's likely or not likely. But if we have to sort of question if it's in dispute, if it's up in the air, if it's reliable or not, then I think we do have a defeater for thinking that our abductive ability is reliable. And if that's the case, then all theories that come by way of abduction, which include naturalism, would then have a defeater for it as well. So there are variations of this sort of evolutionary argument. I've actually defended a slightly different one than Tom Crisp in my work, but I actually prefer Crisp's better. I think that's the best way to go. Okay,
one way that I heard in our discussion was to take this approach, reductive materialism, where your beliefs are just the neurological properties that are going on in your brain. These just are your beliefs. They're reducible to beliefs. And so if that's the case, then it would seem that these neurological properties, the neurons firing in your brain and whatnot, are actually the things that are causing your behavior. And so if you have that, if you have that causal connection there, then it does seem that you could have evolution producing, these sorts of beliefs that are necessary for survival and that kind of thing. So if you could establish that causal connection, then maybe there's a way out of the argument. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think as evident in the discussion, that this formulation that I just gave by Crisp avoids that. I mean, maybe with certain fundamental abductive beliefs, that you need for survival, or if someone broke into your home and ate a bowl of cereal, maybe you think that's the case for that. But it does seem to me quite implausible to think that there's that sort of necessity or that sort of likelihood when it comes to
imagination.
The sort of robust imagination that's needed for abductive reasoning.
Okay, so this, as you said, is a paper that's about to come out. It's very recent, and so
it's already come out online.
Okay,
and I think the volume's forthcoming soon. So.
And so let's go back to that the thing that you mentioned with Michael Bergman, and so his response to help the naturalist is to say that you can rely on these seemings, and so these seemings can sort of overcome the propositional evidence that you've got here. And so what's the general response there? Do you think that that's an acceptable way out of the argument?
So so for the naturalist who's just like, just has these ridiculously strong seemings that even after they understood the Darwinian picture, that our faculties have come about through random genetic mutation, and that they sort of aimed, if you want to say, at producing beliefs that enable survival and reproduction. Right? That's it. For the naturalist who's like, no, I heard the story, I'm reflecting on it. No, I think my faculties are still just reliable. Like, it just seems so evident to me. Like that belief deflects this attempt to feed. I think that's possible. That's a possible move. I'm skeptical on that story coming across as plausible, and the naturalists indeed, after they've fully understood the story, relying on sort of their non-propositional evidence, at least in how many naturalists would do that, or how many at least agnostics about the situation would be willing to go there. But I think there's a sort of a stronger move one can make, and that's, I think, proper function is required. The proper function of our cognitive faculties is required to know something. Right? It's required for warrant. I've defended this in my paper, Warranted Religion. Andrew Moon and Kenny Boyce have a paper recently that has come out on, I think it's something like Swamp Man Takes on Cognitive Science. And they have a defense of the proper function condition there. And then Kenny Boyce and Alan Plantinga have a paper as well called Proper Functionalism that sort of just defends proper functionalism simpliciter that I would recommend people go to. So let's go ahead and just for the moment and buy and say, yeah, these papers are right. We need proper function in order to know something. Well, hey, can naturalism really account for for this sort of normativity? Can naturalism account for what it means for our faculties
to have proper function,
have a way in which they ought to produce beliefs, a way in which they ought to operate? And I argue in a couple of my papers that no, they don't. And in fact, I think it's actually going to be sort of the sort of Judeo-Christian belief that's going to be. I think even Islam, Mormonism, Hinduism, even from Veda Vedanta to the theistic versions of Hinduism, Buddhism, I think they're all going to have trouble accounting for an account of proper function. And so if the naturalist can't account for what it means for our faculties to function properly, then on naturalism, maybe there is no such thing as knowledge.
I got you.
But of course, clearly there is such thing as but clearly we do have knowledge, so therefore naturalism is false.
Okay, so this response here to the evolutionary argument against naturalism, if I can just summarize it real quickly. So we have basically the only way it seems to get out of the argument, at least between us discussing this, is to have this strong seeming.
That's right.
But the first response was to say that not a lot of people or not a lot of atheist philosophers are going to want to go that distance. But then secondly, we have this concept, proper function, or proper functionalism, which is to say that our cognitive faculties must be operating a certain way, and that just can't be accounted for.
That's right.
On naturalism.
That's right.
And so, do you think that would take us away from the argument, away from
so I just take that as a sort of a separate argument, an argument that's quite complementary.
So we'd sort of concede the fact that, okay, this is your way out, but let's now turn to this new argument, this new way of looking at the situation.
Which I think is a bit stronger.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. So then why not just start with that instead of going the whole?
Yeah. Well, so proper functionalism is a popular thesis within the epistemology community, but by no means is it the most popular thesis. And so the evolutionary argument against naturalism is going to appeal to not only proper functionalists but non-proper functionalists as well. Also, I guess I am a bit skeptical, at least in the amount of individuals who, upon hearing the naturalist story about how our faculties came about, will indeed feel good in appealing to that sort of non-propositional evidence.